Tamam.
Feyda hocam böyle bahçe içinde bir yerdesiniz. Neredesiniz öyle?
Ev hocam. Evde.
Ne güzel ya vallahi. Biz de işte okul böyle. Güzel.
That's what I was saying earlier hocam.
Şimdi
Merhaba arkadaşlar.
merhaba Ahmet hocam.
Merhaba
Hoş
Ahmet.
geldiniz.
Nasılsınız? İyisiniz?
Şuradan ben Raşit Hoca'yı sunucu yapayım.
Tamam.
Bir saniye hocam şu ayarlamaları yapayım. Sunucu yapayım ben sizi. Çünkü buradan slaytları açabiliyorsunuz.
Evet.
Değerli katılımcılar, değerli hocalarım hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Tabii katılımcı sayısında hocalarım biraz sıkıntı olabilir. Bu SMS atmada biraz geciktik. Sistemsel sıkıntı vardı. Bir de aceleye geldi bu tabii. Raşit hocamızdan daha sonraları yine böyle seminerler bekliyoruz. Şimdi sözü ben hemen Raşit hocama bırakacağım. Hocam biraz da böyle kısaca tabii sunum dili İngilizce. Siz İngilizce devam edeceksiniz.
Evet.
Kendinizden bahsederek biraz kısaca toplamda da böyle sorular dahil olmak üzere bir saati geçmezse sevinirim.
Tamam.
Buyurun hocam. Buyurun. Söz sizde.
Tamam. Çok teşekkür ederim hocam. Herkese iyi günler, iyi sağlıklı günler diliyorum. Hoş geldiniz. So I'll continue in English now, as Melih Hoca said. So let me just maximize my presentation here. So yes, as you can see, I'll be talking here about this incident that's been dominating the world headlines the last week plus, which is the forced landing of the Ryanair plane flying from Athens to Vilnius in Lithuania on Sunday the week before last, on the 23rd of May. Which was an operation apparently carried out by the Belarusian KGB, which is still called the KGB, by the way, the Committee for State Security, to arrest this young man, Raman Pratasevich'i, who is a very important opposition activist, despite his young age. What I will try to do in this talk is to briefly go over everything that's happened in the last week plus, and a lot has happened during this time, both within Belarus, within Europe, and internationally or globally as well. And as I say here in this poster, I will try to explain the significance of this event and the roots of this sort of strange, unusual sort of occurrence in two different sorts of contexts. One being the ongoing struggle for democracy and free elections in Belarus, which has been going on, well, arguably it's been going on for over 20 years, because Alexander Lukashenko has been the president of Belarus for 26 years, almost 27 now. And out of the 26 years, for 24, he's had dictatorial powers. So one way or another, the struggle for democracy in Belarus has been going on for at least 24 years now in Belarus. But in particular, it went into a very active phase in August of last year. So I will place the events of the last couple of weeks in the context of this ongoing campaign for for a change in government, for a change in political system in Belarus, and I will also place this event in the greater context of relations between Belarus and the European Union, both on the level of governments, so on the level of the Belarusian regime on the one hand, and European Union member states, as well as the Union itself, and also in the context of relations between the Belarusian opposition and the Belarusian independence movement on the one hand, and the EU and its member states on the other. And I will try to end this presentation with the discussion on the implications of what happened for international law. Because international aviation, international air transport, given its international nature, and given the fact that we live in a world of nation states, per force, the ability to travel from one country to another is regulated by intergovernmental treaties and also by international law. So I will try to look briefly at the question of the extent to which what was done by the Belarusian authorities was acceptable under international law, and if it wasn't, exactly what sort of provisions of international law it violated, and then what can be done about it, and what is being done about it. And of course, as you can see on the poster, I would like to say at the outset, of course, that I'm here at Manisa Celal Bayar University as a Canadian citizen. That's what it says on my contract, but I do have two citizenships. I have two passports, a Canadian one and a Belarusian one. I was born in Belarus, and so that gives me, obviously a lifelong interest in everything that happens in Belarus. But also, given that my first language is Russian and I also speak Belarusian, it also gives me access to Belarusian sources, both written in Belarusian and Russian, and both produced within Belarus and outside. And of course, obviously, like any Belarusian, I have a network of contacts who, some of whom are actively involved in the discussions surrounding this issue as we speak. All right, so on Sunday the 23rd, I woke up and was relaxed, and it was a normal Sunday, and I'm sure that's what many, if not most people around the world were doing. But then I heard the news of this very strange occurrence of this Ryanair plane flying from near here. Athens is like a 1-hour flight from Izmir. So a Ryanair plane flying from Athens northwards, flying across Belarusian airspace, heading for Vilnius, and then when it was 30 kilometers from the Lithuanian border, over the Belarusian city of Lida, which I have been to. The last time that Lida played an internationally significant role in world politics was in the 14th century, when it served as the refuge for Khan Tokhtamysh, who was the leader of the Golden Horde. He was a refugee in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania for a while. All these hundreds of years go by, and suddenly Lida is in the world news again, because over Lida, a Belarusian warplane, a MiG-29, intercepts this civilian Irish-owned plane and forces it to divert to Minsk instead of flying 30 more kilometers and crossing into Lithuania, or 70 more kilometers and landing in Vilnius. Vilnius airport was literally visible through the windows of the plane at the point at which it was diverted to Minsk. And of course, as pilots, not of this plane, but of other planes, who were interviewed by journalists afterwards, said, you don't argue with the MiG-29. When it gives you the order to turn around, you turn around. So it landed in Minsk. This is a MiG-29, not necessarily the same one that was used. Belarus has, I think, about 34 of these. And, actually even has the capability to sort of upgrade them using Belarusian domestic technology. So one of these was used, and then here's a zoomed in map. Instead of this short route being taken, the longer route to Minsk was taken. In fact, Vilnius and Minsk were not the only two options. If the plane had to perform an emergency landing, which is what the Belarusian authorities demanded, two other options were Lida itself, where, above which the plane was at that point, because Lida has a Belarusian Air Force base with a long enough landing strip, so it could have landed there. Or there was also Hrodna airport in Belarus around here, but instead the plane was forced to take the longer route to Minsk. And then it landed in Minsk in this dramatic picture captured by Agence France Presse. The passengers were forced to disembark eventually, but here's the luggage. The luggage is set out, and this policeman from the ground, sort of affiliated with the airport, is making quite a show, with the army present as well, of searching these pieces of luggage, the suitcases, for bombs using, the sniffer dog, because allegedly there had been a bomb threat from Hamas, of all people. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But meanwhile, since August of last year, given all the difficult and sometimes quite tragic events that have taken place in Belarus over the last 8 or 9 months, one of the ways in which Belarusians have reacted has been through dark humor. So almost immediately, this meme was produced of a Belarusian MiG-29 flying behind the Ryanair plane. Obviously, this is a copy-paste job, a Photoshop job. And this meme is in response to a statement by the Belarusian Foreign Ministry here in Russian that says that this warplane was scrambled to accompany the Ryanair plane because Belarus was ready to be of assistance to the pilots of the plane, right? The aim was to offer assistance. So here in the meme, the pilot of the warplane says, "Land or else I will assist you." Obviously meaning that this is a threat to shoot the plane down. Whether there was such a threat, it's still not clear, and we'll talk about that later on in this presentation. Now, the alleged reason for the grounding of the plane by Belarus, by the Belarusian authorities, was this emailed threat allegedly from Hamas, with the suitable subject line of Allahu Akbar and the suitable signature line of Allahu Akbar. Now, we have to remember that just 2 days previously, Hamas and Israel had actually signed a ceasefire with the help of Egypt. But whoever wrote this email obviously hadn't heard about the ceasefire. And in this email, Hamas, in quotes, demands a ceasefire, or else they're going to blow up this completely unrelated plane over Vilnius in Lithuania. So Belarus, being such a great international player, according to the Belarusian government, decided to help out, to offer assistance by making this plane land and then searching it for bombs. And of course, no bomb was found because there was no bomb. Later on, a Swiss organization, because this email was allegedly sent from Switzerland, and in fact, it turned out, yes, it was sent from Switzerland, and then the email provider said that, in fact, this email had been sent after the plane had already landed in Minsk. So the story goes like this. The plane was flying over Belarus. It was known to the KGB that Raman Pratasevich'i, this Belarusian opposition activist, was flying over Belarus at that moment. He was, of course, wanted in Belarus on charges of terrorism, no less, for organizing demonstrations. And it was Lukashenko who personally, the current president, Alexander Lukashenko, whom the opposition calls the former president, who personally gave the order for the plane to land. And once it had landed, to be made to land, I should say, once it had landed, this email was produced, allegedly coming from Hamas. Of course, we live in a world of a 24-hour news cycle and easy access to all kinds of personalities. And the response of Hamas itself was sought. And the deputy head of Hamas, Musa Abu Marzouk, said that this action, this fake email produced by the Belarusian government, shows the archaic thinking of the Belarusian government. And he said that Hamas stands against injustice, persecution, attacks on rights, and the violation of the law. So the Belarusian regime found itself in a position where it was being criticized for human rights violations by no less than Hamas. The real target, of course, was Raman Pratasevich'i. Here he is in Poland with Polish refugee papers. Once he had obtained those, he moved on to Lithuania, where he was active in a couple of different Telegram channels. Telegram, of course, was is the main social media app used by not just Belarusian opposition activists, but tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of Belarusians. Some of the most popular channels are followed literally by, say, 600,000 people, which in a population of 9.5 million is quite a remarkable figure. So these Telegram channels have been the main way in which news about ongoing protest actions in Belarus has been spread, and outside Belarus has been spread among the population of Belarus for the last 8 or 9 months since August 2020. Raman Pratasevich'i was earlier on a journalist, but once he was in exile, he mostly became an activist, but in the information sphere, with 2 different Telegram channels, one after the other. Nechta, which means somebody. Well, I'll talk about his channels, the channels he was involved with in a few minutes, actually. But this is why he represented a danger to the regime. He helped people obtain news about protests in real time, through photos, through video that people sent to the channels and that he disseminated, and that his friends and associates disseminated, and then through the sharing of news and analytical articles. This is why this vendetta against him was launched. And of course, so far it has been successful, because a few months ago he had been placed on this Belarusian list of terrorists run by the regime. His friends in exile jokingly referred to him as a terrorist. And now, of course, he's been captured successfully by the Belarusian authorities. And they have released a video where he says, you know, I'm in good health, I'm not being tortured, you know, they're treating me well, and I am confessing to organizing mass disturbances in the city of Minsk. Obviously, this is a forced confession. But he's not the only one, because his girlfriend, Sofia Sapeha, who is a Russian citizen, although at least her mother is Belarusian, and he met her in Vilnius in Lithuania. She's a student at the European Humanities University, which is a kind of Belarusian university in exile located in Lithuania. She has been arrested as well. You know, she was flying on the same plane. She was arrested, and a confession, a video confession, was extracted from her as well, where she incriminates herself, saying that she has been disseminating private information about Belarusian policemen, because, you know, opposition activists have actually been trying to find out, for example, where policemen who've been beating up demonstrators, you know, where they live and things like that, so that people can make them feel that it's not unsafe to beat people up in support of the regime. Well, so she is being blamed for that activity. In support of that allegation, the Belarusian regime has spread the alleged front page of her thesis that she's in the process of writing at the European Humanities University with a Professor Duda, which happens to be the surname of the Polish president, Andrzej Duda. And according to this doctored photo, she is writing a thesis on how to overthrow the Belarusian government using Telegram. So this is proof of her guilt, except that her university actually says there is no Professor Duda at this university, and her thesis is on marriage laws in different countries. It has nothing to do with the Belarusian protests. Putin has asked Lukashenko about how she's being treated, etc., but so far he has not demanded that she be released. And again, the reason for Putin's intervention on her behalf and not on Pratasevich's behalf is that Pratasevich is a Belarusian citizen, while Sofia Sapeha is a Russian citizen. All right, so you see, a number of countries were involved in this incident, and that is what makes this such a complex problem of sort of applied international law and international relations, because this plane was flying from Greece. It was flying to Lithuania. The target of the Belarusian authorities was a man who was under the protection of Poland, although he was and is a Belarusian citizen. But even though he's under the protection of Poland, he was living in Lithuania. The plane is owned by a company based in Ireland, namely Ryanair. Formerly, it was an Irish-British company, except that after Brexit, it wanted to remain an EU airline, and that has its own significance for our story. And so British shareholders were stripped of their voting rights on the board of Ryanair. So now it's a mostly Irish-owned company, So Ireland is involved, except that this particular plane actually belongs to a subsidiary of Ryanair based in Poland. So then it's also a Polish plane. So Greece and Ireland and Lithuania and Poland, of course, all four of these countries that are the most involved next to Belarus, and two of them are geographically next to Belarus, of course, Lithuania and Poland. These four countries are all members of the European Union. So inevitably the European Union as well got involved. Now, many of them are NATO members as well. So inevitably NATO got involved also to some extent. And of course, eventually we'll see that the International Civil Aviation Organization, perforce, also had to get involved. So we have some responses. Of course, there were a multitude really of responses from around the world. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but to just give you the responses from the four countries most closely involved, the Foreign Minister of Greece, Nikos Zenzias, said that, as you can see on your screen, what happened was a state-sponsored abduction. Obviously, not a single country believed in the Hamas story, because, I mean, that story, we can use this language, frankly, is ridiculous. And so what happened was described, as I said, by the Foreign Minister of Greece as a state-sponsored abduction. The Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of Ireland, Micheál Martin, said that this was piracy in the skies. Gitanas Nausėda, the president of Lithuania, said in much stronger language that this was a state-sponsored terror act. And the Prime Minister of Poland, Mateusz Morawiecki, said that this was an unprecedented act of state terrorism. And he didn't stop there. He says that this act cannot go unpunished. So we'll see as we proceed in what ways Belarus has been punished and in what ways it may continue to be punished. And we'll also look actually at whether this act is indeed unprecedented or not, because, for example, Russia argues in the defense of the Belarusian government that this act is not unprecedented, and even the BBC says that this act is not actually unprecedented. So Nausėda, the Lithuanian president, says here in English, as you can see, that the day of the incident, on the 23rd of May, that the airspace over, this is an official Belarusian flag, the airspace over Belarus should be, his suggestion is that it shall be recognized unsafe, that Belarusian aircraft shall not be accepted in EU airports, and that an investigation be launched by the International Civil Aviation Organization, and moreover, that sanctions be imposed on the Belarusian regime. And in fact, all of these things are in one way or another actually taking place. So Lithuania, as the destination of the plane, and also as the place of residence of Raman Pratasevich'i, has taken the lead really, and Poland has been helping Lithuania, supporting Lithuania on the diplomatic front, and been taking a very strong position as well. So here it says in Polish, Premier Mateusz Morawiecki w Wrocławie dzisiaj na Radzie Europejskiej zaproponuje, aby wszystkie loty z terytorium Białorusi do Unii Europejskiej i w drugą stronę zostały wstrzymane do czasu, aż Raman Pratasevich'i zostanie uwolniony. Right? So to translate this from Polish, Mateusz Morawiecki is saying in Poland, in Wrocław, that he's going to propose at the European Council that all flights from the territory of Belarus to the European Union and vice versa should be held up, should be stopped until Raman Pratasevich'i is released. The result of this pressure on the rest of the EU from Lithuania and Poland has been that this whole orange area of the map of Europe is now out of bounds, well, map of Western Eurasia really, is now out of bounds for Belavia planes. Belavia is the national airline of Belarus, and it's also fully owned by the state. Now, the orange area does not include the whole of the EU. Of course, there is the odd one out, which is Hungary. And of course, Viktor Orban has his own ideas about international diplomacy, etc., except that Hungary has also clearly condemned the Belarusian government for doing what it did, but it did not go so far as to ban flights from Belarus. Also, certain non-EU countries have joined in the ban. First of all, Britain, which did so before the EU, actually. Well, Britain, as I said, had been a co-owner of, not Britain as a country, but British shareholders had been a co-owner of Ryanair, so Britain took it personally as well. And also, of course, Ukraine, which is striving to join the EU as a strategic goal, not in the next few years, but eventually. Ukraine, of course, has also joined in this ban on Belavia flights flying to Ukraine, and also even Belavia flights flying over Ukraine. And of course, all of these countries have also suspended their own flights from going to Belarus. Now, Belarus, is on it likes to see itself as the center of Europe, because of course half of Europe literally is in Russia. Belarus earns several $100 million each year through overflights, because, all kinds of planes, American planes flying to China, Russian planes flying all kinds of planes tend to fly over Belarus. It's the shortest route to many places. And now Belarus is going to miss out on much of that revenue, but not all, because, for example, China and Russia and so on are still sending their planes over Belarus and to Belarus, as is Turkey. And of course, Belarusian planes, as I've been saying, have continued to be able to fly here to Turkey, both to Istanbul, and there have been charter flights to Izmir as well. Now, Belavia, the Belarusian airline, has responded with humor. So here is the sad Belavia plane saying in Russian, "Хочу летать," I want to fly. And here he is dreaming of London. Poor thing. I do feel bad for Belavia. Really, the employees of the airline are not responsible for what the state has done. And, I have been flying on Belavia since 1995. Most Belarusians, have flown on Belavia at one time or another, and many do every year. And so there have been a lot of messages of sympathy for them on Facebook, but also a lot of messages, a lot of comments saying, well, we're sorry for what happened to you, but please go complain to the man who did this, because we all know who that man is. The closure of much of European airspace to Belarusian aviation was demonstrated in particular a few days ago when a Belarusian plane, a Belavia plane, was trying to fly to Barcelona. Spanish airspace was not closed yet to Belarusian planes at that point. But this plane, once it had flown almost to the border between Belarus and Poland, was stopped by Poland from entering because down the line, a couple of countries down, France had informed Poland that it would not allow this plane to fly over French territory. And so these poor Belarusian pilots spent 3 hours in the air with their passengers negotiating with Polish ground control. And meanwhile, they were spiraling over Belarus in this shape until they gave up and they flew back to Minsk. And so this has been seen as, both a source of humor among Belarusians and, of course, a source of sadness as well. Because, of course, this does indicate that Belarus, which had already been quite isolated, and it wasn't just the regime that was isolated, the Belarusian population has also been, isolated in the last 20-odd years, because unlike, for example, Ukrainians, Belarusians need a Schengen visa to go to Europe, and that's not always easy to get, etc., etc. So this isolated population is more isolated now. But of course, the aim is to isolate the already isolated regime more. The same method works against both sides. What about the Russian reaction? Well, Putin has very publicly supported Lukashenko. He invited Lukashenko to Russia to express this support. Earlier on, Sergei Lavrov, basically the face of Russian diplomacy for many years now, Lavrov, took to the world stage defending the actions of the Belarusian regime, basically defending Belarus's right to arrest its own citizen on its own territory, using whatever means it wants, including forcing a foreign civilian plane to land in Minsk. And of course, Sergei Lavrov has pointed out an interesting incident that occurred in 2013. which is that the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, had been attending a conference in Moscow and was flying back on the Bolivian presidential plane to Bolivia. And he flew over a couple of countries and then eventually reached Austria. And then from Austria, the plane was going to fly towards Bolivia, either over France or over Spain or over Portugal eventually or over Italy. So all four of these countries closed their airspace to this plane on the request of the United States, because the US thought that Edward Snowden, who had been in Moscow, was being shipped by Evo Morales for some reason to Bolivia. That actually was not happening. Edward Snowden, who had been leaking American NSA, National Security Administration documents about spying activities, of the American government. So Edward Snowden, of course, was wanted by the US. He had taken refuge in Moscow. Bolivia had said that it might take him in, except that he was simply not on this plane. But so the plane was forced to land in Vienna. Eventually, one of the leaders of Austria, I forget whether it was the chancellor or the president, went to the plane the following day and had breakfast on board the plane with Evo Morales to make him feel a little bit better. But of course, afterwards, not just Bolivia, but also Argentina, Cuba, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Uruguay, and Venezuela. So a lot of left-wing and right-wing Latin American countries lodged a formal complaint with the Secretary General of the United Nations against this action, against the forced landing of Evo Morales' plane, basically at the request, almost on the orders of the United States. Nobody got punished as a result of this complaint. So this is what Sergei Lavrov was reminding the world of and saying, well, if the Europeans can do this with the president of Bolivia, why can Lukashenko not do this with his own citizens? So that's the Russian approach towards defending Lukashenko. The other approach is no less tangible, because Putin at this meeting promised Lukashenko $500 million, not personally, but a credit to Belarus of $500 million this month in June. And he also asked Lukashenko, to make sure that Sofia Sapeho is treated fairly. All right. But what about other countries? I mean, we've looked at the roles of Lithuania and Poland. We will look at the roles of international organizations eventually. For now, what I want to do is look at why this current crisis is basically the worst stage of an ongoing crisis between the Lukashenko regime on the one hand and Poland and Lithuania on the other. For one thing, as I said in my lecture on Belarus that I delivered through our home department, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, here at Celal Bayar University in September of last year. As I was saying then, Lithuania and Belarus have 500 years of history together as what was known as the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So both are quite interested in what happens in the other. Secondly, Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus together used to be the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, also for over 200 years. So Poland also tends to be quite interested in what happens in Belarus, and vice versa. Here you have flags flying in Lithuania, the Lithuanian official flag, the EU flag, the flag of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which also plays like a secondary role in modern Lithuania, and then the flag of the opposition flag of Belarus, the flag of Belarusian independence in 1918 and 1991, that Lithuanian officials are flying in sympathy with the Belarusian democratic movement. But also, of course, Nechta, the Telegram channel that Pratasevich originally was working for, is based in, well, I mean, partly in Poland, partly in Lithuania. It's really basically Belarusian activists in these two countries who are active with these sorts of channels, partly because apart from the shared history, apart from the shared culture, apart from the fact that there are all kinds of not only similarities, but also connections already, because these countries have minorities on each other's territories, etc. Apart from all of that, there's also the fact that within the European Union, really nobody cares about what happens in Belarus nearly as much as Lithuania and Belarus do, because most other countries in the European Union, not all, but most, consider Belarus to be a faraway, sort of unknown place. You know, Neville Chamberlain said about Czechoslovakia before the Second World War that Czechoslovakia is a faraway country about whose people we know nothing, right? That was this infamous statement. Well, I think most leaders of the EU before this plane incident would have said the same thing about Belarus, but not Lithuanians, not Poles. They care. But also, for that reason, they have given refuge to large numbers of Belarusian opposition activists and made it possible for them to work there, you know, towards democratic change in Belarus. So Nechta is probably the most important opposition Telegram channel. The word means somebody, right? And it's like, you know, Nechta told me as in somebody told me. It's like a sort of linguistic joke. But then eventually, Pratasevich'i had gone on to work for another Telegram channel called Belarus Головного Mozga in Russian, which means Belarus of the brain, meaning that Belarus is a type of brain disease. Meaning, you know, what is currently happening in Belarus or the Belarusian regime is a type of brain disease. And here is his channel, you know, that he had been most recently involved with, sharing this picture to its, you know, multitude of subscribers, you know, 267,000 subscribers, of this photo of Pratasevich'i calling for his freedom, located in Vilnius airport. So here's Vilnius airport, you know, flying the white, red, white Belarusian independence flag, and also this picture from Raman Pratasevich'i. Of course, Vilnius airport is not the only airport that's doing this. For example, Paris Charles de Gaulle airport is also kind of showing a picture of Pratasevich'i on its departure board. So yes, as you know, as I was saying in September, you know, in my talk then, the whole thing really started with a disputed election, according to the opposition, a completely falsified election that took place in August of 2020. The results were not believed in by almost anybody, including some, you know, people who helped organize the election in one district or another. As a result, hundreds of thousands of people in Belarus came out onto the streets. The police responded with unprecedented brutality. There were people beaten on the streets, arrested en masse. Over 30,000 people were arrested during these protests and in the aftermath. Usually those arrested were beaten and tortured, at least in the first few months. In particular the men, but the women were also not spared in many cases. And then eventually they were given short jail terms, most of them of a couple of weeks or a week, and also given pretty large fines by Belarusian standards, meant to punish them financially. So people sympathetic to the Belarusian opposition cause started donating money to pay off the fines from abroad, and the Belarusian regime, you know, stopped those kinds of payments to make sure that those found guilty are the ones who pay the fine. But for over 400 people, it's not as easy as that. For 449 people, you know, they've been given long jail terms of several years, sometimes 6 years, for example. And of course, Raman Pratasevich'i, since he's been charged with terrorism, he faces the death penalty, because Belarus is the only country in Europe that actually still has the death penalty. I mean, it used to be Belarus and Russia and Turkey. Russia has imposed a moratorium on the death penalty. Turkey, of course, abolished it, hoping to join the European Union. But Belarus has, under Lukashenko, has no prospect of joining the European Union. So it still has the death penalty, which is what Pratasevich'i is facing. But these political prisoners, 449 people, they are people who've already been found guilty of, you know, one crime or another. And so these are just some of them. You know, we've seen the face of Pratasevich'i everywhere, from Paris to Vilnius to everywhere. But these are people who nobody has heard about outside Belarus, outside maybe also Poland and Lithuania. And these are just 8 of them, ordinary people: Sergei Shabunya, Sergei Rozum, Vladimir Katyuka, etc. These are 8 of them. Now multiply this by 50 and more than 50, and then you will see, you know, what the picture is like with the human rights situation in Belarus. So one of the main people struggling against what is happening in Belarus, but from outside, per force from outside, is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the main opposition candidate at the election of last year, who, according to the opposition, actually won. I mean, there's no sort of fireproof or ironclad sort of proof that that Tikhanovskaya actually did win the election. But from the few districts where the election officials actually gave out honest results. In those she was the clear winner. So people have extrapolated from those to say that yes, she has won the election outright. So she has, although she just stepped into the election to replace her husband who had been arrested previously, she has taken on the mantle of the national leader of Belarus, albeit again in exile in Lithuania. And here there was a Zoom meeting, with the Canadian foreign minister at the time, Champagne, and Linkevičius, the Lithuanian foreign minister, with Champagne saying, we have your back. And of course, outside the EU, it's countries like Britain and Ukraine and Canada, which are the most interested in, in what is happening in Belarus. But even outside those areas, you have situations where clear expressions of solidarity with the Belarusian opposition movement are being made, such as at the International Ice Hockey Federation, Hockey World, or like the Hockey World Championship, which is taking place in Riga in Latvia. You had the picture of the mayor of Riga, Marcin Stakis, who pulled down the official Belarusian flag and replaced it with this, not even the official opposition flag, but this protest flag, which combines the flag with the coat of arms, the flag of 1991 to 95 with the coat of arms of that time, which is a historic symbol of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And this was done to express his support for the Belarusian democracy movement. Of course, this is not allowed under international sports rules. You have to fly the official flag of a country. So the International Ice Hockey Federation wrote him a letter and said, you know what, either take down this opposition flag or take down our international hockey flag. And he said, I would rather take down the international hockey flag, for which he has been hailed as a hero in Belarus and a sex symbol. And some people in Belarus want to name a street in his honor once Lukashenko is chased out of power. And he's been giving interviews to sort of Belarusian media abroad and things like that. Tikhanovskaya, she says here in Belarusian that she wants Belarus potentially to be expelled from the International Civil Aviation Organization. So she wants very, very severe sanctions, because if Belarus is expelled from ICAO, from the International Civil Aviation Organization, that would mean that nobody will be able to fly to Belarus, including the Russians and the Turks and the Chinese, nor will anybody be able to fly from Belarus. And of course, this would mean, an even, stronger isolation for the Belarusian regime. Unfortunately, the side effect would be an even much stronger isolation for the Belarusian people, because then they would have to take the bus or the train to Moscow in Russia to fly anywhere, essentially. Or if they have a Schengen visa, they can take the bus or train to Vilnius. But now, of course, with the COVID-19 situation, there are sort of restrictions on the EU border and so on. So this would make things difficult, but also, for the people, but also for the regime. And so Tikhanovskaya is taking that position right now, and she's touring Europe arguing for that position. Like just today, I saw a tweet from her meeting Estonian leaders at the sort of prime ministerial level and trying to persuade them that this is kind of what should be done. On the other hand, you have Yarek Krivoy here, who is an expert in international law. He is a senior fellow in international economic law at the British Institute for I think it's called for Development and International Law. And he says here in Belarusian, in a Facebook post, that doing this, preventing Belarusians from flying, will only sort of bring Belarus even closer into the Russian orbit, and it will force Belarusians to travel through Moscow, and Belarus would then become an appendage to Russia, a bit like the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, which is this pro-Russian rebel area in eastern Ukraine that proclaimed its independence in 2014 and is being supplied by Russian weapons and Russian money. If people from that area want to travel, they do it through Russia. So Yarek Krivoy, as a Belarusian expert in international law working in Britain, says that the effect on Belarus will be on regular Belarusian people will be quite negative, and in fact would be quite different from what the opposition wants. Now, NATO, given that this plane had been flying from Greece, one NATO member, to Lithuania, another NATO member, was registered in Poland, yet another NATO member, NATO had to take a position on what was happening. And it says here in this statement, that the act is unacceptable, that it violated the norms governing civil aviation, and also that it endangered the lives of passengers and crew. So apart from that, though, apart from what happened to the plane, they also want Pratasevich'i and his girlfriend Sapeha to be released. On top of that, of course, they want Latvian diplomats to be allowed back into Belarus. The story of the Latvian diplomats is that once the mayor of Riga lowered the official Belarusian flag, as shown in that picture, and raised the Belarusian sort of protest flag, then Belarus expelled all Latvian diplomats except one from the country. And NATO is calling on Belarus to allow them back in. Now, there was a Reuters report a few days ago saying that NATO had been intending to take a much stronger stance against the Belarusian regime, use much stronger language, and that it was blocked from doing so by Turkey because of the sort of quite good relationship on a personal level between the leaders of the two countries. Now, the positive aspect of the positive relationship between the leadership of the two countries, of Belarus and Turkey, is that Belarusians don't need a visa to travel to Turkey, for up to a month, and nor do Turks to travel to Belarus. But then, in this case, NATO found itself disunited. It was unanimous except for Turkey. Now, you see a group of Belarusians in Montreal, where the International Civil Aviation Organization is based. Of course, I've walked past this building many times, as anyone in Montreal has. They are demanding that ICAO sort of take strong action, and of course, not because of this small group of Belarusian protesters, but because of international pressure. ICAO did hold an emergency meeting just this past Thursday to discuss what was happening in Belarus. With the forced landing of the plane, and it has decided to carry out an official investigation. Of course, the Belarusian authorities have promised that they will cooperate with this investigation, and the Russian authorities have repeated this promise on behalf of the Belarusians. But the Russian authorities have also sent out a warning. So after this meeting was held on Thursday, a few hours after that, one Austrian plane and one French plane flying to Russia, while avoiding Belarusian airspace, were forced by the Russians to turn back. They were not allowed by Russia into Russian airspace. And this, I personally interpret this as a signal from the Russian authorities to the International Civil Aviation Organization, saying, if you are too strict on Belarus with your investigation, then this conflict could potentially be widened. And just as some countries are now boycotting Belarus in terms of aviation, Russia could respond with boycotts of its own. And while Belarus, of course, is a very small player on the global market in terms of aviation, but also on the global stage in terms of power politics, Russia is a much bigger player. And so it's really kind of throwing its weight behind Russia. But of course, also it's throwing its weight behind Belarus, but also pulling Belarus closer in towards its alliance with Russia is useful towards the fulfillment of Putin's goals with regard to a closer union between Belarus and Russia. Now, as the BBC points out, it was not Lukashenko who invented this practice of sending a fighter plane to force a foreign civilian plane to land. It wasn't even Austria or other European countries that invented this practice, and I'm referring here to the Evo Morales case, of course. Apparently, from what the BBC has been able to find, the first country to do this was France. So there had been a civilian passenger plane flying from Rabat in Morocco to Tunis in Tunisia in 1956. By then, both Morocco and Tunisia were independent, but they were flying over Algeria, which at the time was, of course, being ruled by France, and France said that officially this was actually part of France. And on board this plane were 5 leaders of the Front de la Libération Nationale, the National Liberation Front, which was fighting for Algerian independence. And these 5 leaders of the FLN were flying to Tunis for a conference at the invitation of President Bourguiba of Tunisia. And France sent warplanes into the air to force the foreign civilian plane to land in Algiers. And it took those 5 Algerian FLN leaders and arrested them. But shortly thereafter, in 1962, Algeria did grant, with the decision of President Charles de Gaulle, France granted independence to Algeria. And then one of the men who had been arrested through this military action in Algiers, namely Ahmed Ben Bella, who had been arrested and imprisoned, he became the first president of Algeria. Here he is in 1963, representing Algeria at the United Nations. And behind him, nice coincidence, is a delegation of Belarus. Now, you might be wondering what Belarus is doing at the UN in 1963 if it became independent in 1991. And the fact is that Belarus, like Ukraine, has been a UN member, not since 1991, but since 1945. So the allies, the victorious allies in the Second World War, took the decision that because of the uniquely high level of suffering of the Belarusian people and the Ukrainian people in the Second World War, even though these two were member states of the Soviet Union and not independent states, they were allowed to be full members of the United Nations from 1945 onwards. And so here is Belarus sitting behind Algeria, sitting behind this man, who was the first victim, one of the first victims of this kind of incident. And now, so really, the question about what happens now involves two things. One is the international dimension. In the international dimension, the question is whether Belarus, the Belarusian regime, through its actions, violated the Chicago Convention, which governs international civilian aviation. This is an international treaty signed in 1944. Its provisions are self-contradictory, which is what happens sometimes. So Article 1 of this convention says every state has complete and exclusive sovereignty over airspace above its territory, right? So the complete and exclusive sovereignty over Belarusian airspace belongs to Belarus. So by this clause, or this article, if Belarus wants to arrest a Belarusian citizen in Belarusian airspace or on the Belarusian ground, it can do so. But then there's Article 3 bis, which says every state must refrain from resorting to the use of weapons against civilian aircraft in flight, right? And Belarus sending its warplane against a civilian aircraft in flight over its territory is a violation, potentially, of Article 3. So here you have two principles of international law enshrined in this international convention to which Belarus is party, which are in contradiction to each other. And so I'm sure that the ICAO investigation will see to what extent Belarus or the Belarusian government was justified in its actions under Article 1, and to what extent it had violated international law through its actions under Article 3. More broadly, there is concern and there's worry around the world now that other countries may think if Lukashenko is able to get away with this fairly scot-free, apart from the fact that Belarusian planes have been banned from a lot of countries, then there is concern that other countries may learn from this example and may start arresting their dissidents while they're flying in the sky above their countries. And this, of course, would set a very dangerous precedent, and various international leaders have pointed this out explicitly. So there are plans for further EU sanctions. I mean, already, even previously, because of the severe repression of the democracy movement in Belarus last year, there have been targeted EU sanctions brought in against Lukashenko and against more than 80 other people in Lukashenko's close circle in the official sort of Belarusian leadership, from the governmental side. And also there have been sanctions against 7 companies. Now the EU is talking about this summer bringing in sanctions against another major Belarusian company, a state-owned company called Belarus-AB, which makes nitrate fertilizers, which are one of Belarus's main exports to the rest of the world. So that's the international dimension. As for the dimension of Belarus itself, well, here's the recent, protest poster made by a Belarusian artist that shows, that if you hang up underwear in the wrong color, you can get arrested. If you wear clothes of the wrong color, you can get arrested, potentially or sometimes actually. If you wear the coat of arms going back to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, you can get arrested. If you run a Belarusian media website based in Belarus, namely tut.by, it wasn't an exiled one like the other ones I mentioned. It was a local one. The most important sort of opposition, or not even opposition, but independent news source. Well, you can get arrested as its journalists were a few days before Raman Pratasevich'i was arrested, and this website was shut down. If you simply are a woman in a red and white dress, you can be arrested. This is the situation in Belarus right now. It doesn't look like it's going to change, anytime soon. But of course, the struggle for democracy in Belarus goes on. And with that, I would like to thank you very, very much for your attention. And I would be happy to take questions from the audience if there are any. Thanks.
Rashed Hocam, teşekkürler. Thank you very much for your presentation and informative explanations.
Thank you.
This current crisis between Belarus and EU or rest of the Europe or rest of the world.
Right.
And actually we are out of time, but is there any comment or question from our participants or audiences? We can take them. Soru varsa değerli katılımcılar, hocalarımız, öğrenci arkadaşlarımız, Rashed Hoca bu sohbet kısmından da yazabilirler veya el kaldırıp söyleyebilirler. Herhalde yok hocam. Ahmet hocam buyurun.
Yes, I want to speak about on the international law side, I think.
Yes.
Yes, as a lecturer of international law.
Right.
Yes, it is my interest. I think it's going into my interest.
Exactly.
Yes. So, what is the sanction, do you think, about the Belarus violation of the Convention of Aviation? You say in 1944.
Right.
Will there be any sanction, do you think, about this?
Right. Yeah. That's a very good question, Hojam. Thank you so much. That is basically the $1 million question right now, because there have been EU sanctions already, but that largely has not been under the rubric of Belarus violating the Warsaw Convention in particular, but rather Belarus forcing an EU-owned plane to land when that plane had been flying from the EU and to the EU. So essentially, this was seen as a violation of the rights of an EU business and also of the violation of the rights of EU citizens, because of course most of the people on board, or many of the people on board, had been EU citizens as well. But if anybody is going to pursue Belarus or sort of try to punish the Belarusian government under the rubric specifically of violating the Warsaw Convention, this will be something recommended by the International Civil Aviation Organization. Now, the ICAO is a UN body, and as such, it is of course much more multilateral than the EU, and includes countries like Russia, which have taken the side of Belarus actually. So it's sort of hard to see how a very strong measure of punishment can be taken by ICAO without being prevented by Russia. And so regarding sanctions, the sanctions that that certain EU leaders have been calling for, and the sanctions that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the Belarusian opposition leader, has been calling for, would include actually not allowing any flights to or from Belarus, because this would be extremely painful and noticeable for the Belarusian government. Right now, it's like, yes, you cannot fly to Western Europe, but the Belarusian government already was not friends with Western Europe and already did not really like Belarusians having too many contacts with Western Europe. So perhaps they don't really see it as a huge punishment, while ordinary people, of course, do. And even among ordinary people, views are divided. Some are in favor of very strict sanctions and some are against sanctions because they believe common people are the ones who are going to suffer. Now, as for international sanctions recommended by ICAO, there was a lot of willingness actually among some member states, which was discussed on Thursday at this meeting. But then on Friday, Russia sent the signal, by banning these 2 EU planes from its airspace, which indicated that Russia is willing to actually broaden the conflict and deepen the conflict on behalf of Belarus if the ICAO does not back down and if the ICAO does not soften its stance. And Lavrov again went on the warpath, went on the offensive, and he said, Lavrov being the Russian foreign minister, and he said, look, if you want to investigate Belarus, do investigate it, but Belarus has promised that it will cooperate, allow them to cooperate, and don't push for punishments and don't push for sanctions. So Hocam, just to answer your question in one sentence, I think that further international sanctions taken by ICAO or taken by the UN at this stage are quite unlikely. I think that whatever sanctions come will come from the EU and other Western countries.
Some member countries can take this event to the EU General Assembly, do you think?
The UN General Assembly, it is possible, Hocam, because of course, if they take it to the Security Council, then of course, whatever measure is voted for, Russia will impose a veto on it, and I think China would also impose a veto on it. But as for the General Assembly, yes, nobody has veto power in the General Assembly, so I think that it is possible that it might be discussed. But I think that because ICAO within the UN structure, I mean, the UN has quite a quite a multi-arm, multi-dimensional, complicated structure. So within this structure, ICAO has the main responsibility within the UN, for overseeing matters related to aviation, or civilian aviation, certainly. And so I don't think that anybody will be able to take this matter to the General Assembly without ICAO first drawing up conclusions. And I think most likely those conclusions, once they are drawn up, will be taken for further analysis or votes or whatever to bodies such as the UN General Assembly. But first, ICAO will investigate. Now, there was some possibility. Some analysts were thinking actually that ICAO might actually expel Belarus or suspend Belarusian membership as early as last Thursday. Of course, that didn't happen. What happened was the promise of an investigation. Now, this investigation may take several months. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a kind of long, drawn-out process. I mean, so far, actually, just to give you an indication of the time scale, the black boxes of the Ryanair plane have still not been analyzed, because the black boxes show the communications between the Belarusian fighter plane and the pilots of that Ryanair plane. So we don't know whether the pilot actually said explicitly, I will shoot you down if you don't land in Minsk, or if he just hinted at that. Now, Poland and Lithuania are both saying Poland is the owner of the plane and Lithuania is the destination of the plane. They're saying that they will investigate it, except that they don't have the capability of investigating black boxes. So even within the EU bureaucratic structure, things are getting stuck, let alone the UN bureaucratic structure, which is much more complicated. So I think that this will be a long, drawn-out process, and any real and painful action against the Belarusian government will be coming from the EU. And I think that the main reason that this is at all coming from the EU is because Poland and Lithuania are both very closely involved, and by coincidence, they also happen to be the countries that take the greatest amount of interest in what happens in Belarus outside that area itself.
So you, as I understand, EU is getting some responsibility because of the Poland and Lithuania, I think.
Exactly, Hocam. Yes, because those countries have historical ties to Belarus, and they are actually interested in what's happening, and they've taken very clear positions in favor of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and they're flying the Belarusian opposition flag from government buildings all over Poland, in many different cities in Poland, and also on government buildings in Lithuania. And this has been going on for months. Because of this, and because then it just so happens that the plane was owned, yes, it's an Irish company, but their Polish subsidiary owns this particular plane, and because it was flying to Lithuania, these two countries feel personally involved and personally insulted, and now they're not easily going to let this case go, and they're going to, bug the rest of the EU into sort of staying on this course. Of course, other EU countries have expressed their indignation, such as France, such as Germany, but it's possible that without the leadership of Lithuania and Poland, they may have just restricted themselves to statements or to, sanctions against perhaps Lukashenko personally and so on. But the event has taken on the scale that it has, largely because of the relentless push from the governments of both Lithuania and Poland.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rashed Hocam.
Thank you.
All right.
Other comments or questions? Herhalde yok Raşit Hocam.
Evet.
Teşekkür ediyoruz katılımınız için.
Ben teşekkür ederim.
Yeni bir İBF tartışıyor seminerinde Perşembe görünüyor. Görüşmek dileğiyle. Herkese teşekkür ediyoruz katılımınız için. Mutlu, sağlıklı günler diliyoruz. Hoşça kalın.
Thank you, Rashed Hocam. It was very good.
Thank you.
Thank you hocam.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye.